May 18th, 1565. The Mediterranean dawn revealed a sight that should have ended European Christianity forever. Across the azure waters of Malta's rocky shores, 193 Ottoman warships stretched to the horizon, their red banners snapping in the morning breeze. Aboard those vessels, 40,000 of Islam's finest warriors, prepared for what Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had promised would be his crowning achievement. Standing on the limestone ramparts of Fort St. Angelo, Grand Master Jean de Valette watched through his spyglass as the armada that had conquered Rhodes, terrorized Venice, and swept the eastern Mediterranean clean of Christian resistance, now focused its overwhelming might on his tiny island. He commanded exactly 500 knights of St. John and 8,000 Maltese militia, against odds of nearly 5-1. Military mathematics said Malta would fall in a week. Picture this massive Ottoman fleet as it approaches. Each galley carries 200 men, their bronze cannons glinting in the sunlight. The flagship alone displaces 200 tons, mounting 64 guns, capable of hurling 50-pound stone balls over half a mile. The dust cloud from 25,000 soldiers marching in formation could be seen from 10 miles away. When the fleet anchored in Marsa-Sirocco Bay, the combined weight of men and equipment was enough to make the shallow waters visibly rise. But here's what the Ottoman chronicles don't tell you. This wasn't just another conquest for Suleiman. This was personal revenge. 43 years earlier, a young knight named Jean de Valette had helped humiliate the Sultan during the knight's desperate evacuation from Rhodes. The then 27-year-old Valette had personally commanded the rear guard that held Ottoman forces long enough for the garrison to escape with their weapons and honor intact. Suleiman, barely 28 himself, and hungry to prove his worthiness to succeed his father, had been forced to grant the knights safe passage after months of siege. The memory of those defiant Christian banners sailing away from his conquered island had festered in the Sultan's mind through 4 decades of triumph. Now, Suleiman ruled an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from Crimea to Cairo. His armies had shattered Hungarian knighthood at Mohacs, besieged the gates of Vienna, and turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. At 71, he commanded resources that dwarfed any European power. The siege train approaching Malta included 64 bronze cannons, each requiring 12 oxen to move, capable of firing 6,000 rounds per day. Behind Admiral Piali Pasha's naval expertise stood General Mustafa Pasha, veteran of a dozen successful sieges, commanding 15,000 elite Janissaries who had never known defeat. Against this oceanic force, Valette had assembled what appeared to be a hopeless defense. Malta's strategic position made it the cork in the Mediterranean bottle. Control the island, and Ottoman fleets could strike Sicily, Naples, even Rome itself. The knights understood the mathematics of desperation. Their treasury held enough silver to hire perhaps 2,000 mercenaries for 3 months. The island's limestone soil barely supported 20,000 inhabitants, producing insufficient grain to feed the defenders through a long siege. Water came from rainwater cisterns that could be contaminated by enemy action. Yet as Ottoman landing boats hit Malta's southern beaches on May 19th, something impossible began to unfold. Valette had spent 43 years transforming this barren rock into Europe's deadliest fortress trap. The Ottomans expected another Rhodes, a swift siege followed by negotiated surrender. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy who had studied every detail of their tactics, anticipated their every move, and prepared surprises that would cost Suleiman's empire far more than one small island was worth. The question wasn't whether Malta would fall. The question was how many of Islam's finest warriors would die discovering that some prizes carry prices too terrible to pay. The Ottoman landing force struck Malta's southern coast like a bronze-tipped spear thrust into limestone. By dawn on May 20th, Mustafa Pasha had established his beachhead at Marsa-Sirocco Bay with surgical precision, deploying 8,000 Janissaries in perfect formation, while sappers began dragging the massive siege guns inland. The knights watching from Burgu's walls counted 64 bronze cannons, each weighing 3 tons and requiring teams of 40 men to position. What should have been a chaotic amphibious assault had become a textbook demonstration of Ottoman military efficiency. Valette stood on the ramparts of Fort St. Angelo, his weathered hands gripping the limestone battlements as he studied the enemy deployment through his brass spyglass. At 70, the Grand Master had witnessed more sieges than any living commander, but the methodical precision of Mustafa's approach sent ice through his veins. The Ottoman general was systematically establishing artillery positions that would allow him to bombard all three Christian strongholds simultaneously. Birgu, Senglea, and the small fortress of St. Elmo formed a triangle around Grand Harbour, Malta's natural anchorage where the knight's few remaining galleys lay moored like trapped birds. Then came the decision that would haunt military historians for centuries. Instead of concentrating his overwhelming firepower on Birgu, the knight's main stronghold, Mustafa chose to begin with St. Elmo. The tiny star fort commanded the entrance to Grand Harbour, with its 8 cannons and garrison of exactly 120 men under Captain Luis de Miranda. Ottoman military doctrine demanded securing one's flanks before advancing, and since St. Elmo's position threatened any ships attempting to enter the harbour. What appeared to be sound tactical thinking was actually the first link in a chain that would strangle the Ottoman war machine. Here's what Mustafa's staff officers couldn't have known about Valette's defensive genius. St. Elmo wasn't meant to be defended indefinitely. The fort's angular bastions and carefully calculated fields of fire had been designed as a killing ground, a place where Ottoman assault troops would die in such numbers that the siege would become economically unsustainable. Every stone had been positioned to channel attacking forces into interlocking zones of crossfire. The approach routes forced enemies to advance uphill across 200 yards of open ground swept by artillery from 3 directions. By May 24th, the Ottoman siege train had completed its deadly crescendo. 64 cannons opened fire simultaneously at dawn, their bronze voices echoing across the Mediterranean like thunder trapped in a stone bowl. The mathematical precision was staggering. Each gun could fire 12 rounds per hour, meaning 768 stone balls, weighing 50 pounds each, crashed into St. Elmo's walls every 60 minutes. The limestone fortifications, 15 feet thick at their base, began to crack and crumble under impacts that struck with the force of modern artillery. Captain Miranda's 120 defenders crouched in the smoking ruins as stone fragments filled the air like deadly snow. The sensory assault was overwhelming. The crash of cannonballs striking stone, the screams of wounded men, the acrid smoke that turned noon into twilight. Yet the fort's angular design was working exactly as Valette had planned. Cannonballs that would have punched clean through traditional round towers struck the angled bastions and deflected harmlessly into the harbour. What should have been a 3-day bombardment was stretching into its second week, but then everything changed. As the guns fell silent on June the 2nd, Ottoman trumpets sounded the advance. 8,000 janissaries emerged from their trenches in perfect formation, their white felt caps bobbing like a deadly sea as they surged towards St. Elmo's shattered walls. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Each janissary had trained for 15 years in weaponscraft, siege warfare, and absolute obedience to orders. They had stormed the walls of Belgrade, Constantinople, and Rhodes. A handful of knights behind crumbling stone barriers should have lasted minutes. The first assault wave hit St. Elmo's breach like a human tsunami. What happened next defied every principle of siege warfare that Mustafa had learned in 30 years of conquest. Instead of overwhelming the tiny garrison through sheer numbers, the janissaries found themselves funneled into a nightmare of crossbow bolts and Greek fire that turned their disciplined advance into a charnel house. By sunset, 400 elite Ottoman troops lay dead in the rubble for the loss of exactly 12 knights. The mathematics of attrition had suddenly, impossibly, reversed. The siege of St. Elmo entered its 3rd week, with the mathematical precision of a death clock. Each dawn brought the same ritual. Ottoman cannons thundered for exactly 4 hours, reducing more limestone to powder. Each afternoon delivered fresh waves of janissaries, crashing against the diminishing walls like ocean swells against a crumbling cliff. By June 10th, Captain Miranda's original 120 defenders had been reduced to 80 effective fighters, yet the tiny fort still flew its white banner with the 8-pointed cross of the Knights of St. John. Mustafa Pasha stood in his command tent, studying casualty reports that made no mathematical sense. His staff had calculated that St. Elmo should have fallen in 5 days maximum. The reality staring back from blood-stained parchment told a different story. 3,000 Ottoman dead against 40 night casualties. At this exchange rate, taking the main fortresses of Birgu and Senglea would cost him his entire army. The general who had conquered Belgrade and Damascus found himself trapped in an arithmetic nightmare of his own making. Here's where legend meets brutal reality. Each night, as Ottoman sentries watched St. Elmo's walls, dark shapes moved across Grand Harbour like water spirits. Knights were swimming the 400-yard channel between Birgu and St. Elmo, carrying fresh ammunition and reinforcements to the doomed garrison. The volunteers knew they were swimming towards certain death, yet they came anyway. Fra Roberto di Eboli made the crossing 7 times, each journey laden with Greek fire and crossbow bolts. On his 8th attempt, Turkish arquebusiers found their mark. His body washed ashore at dawn, still clutching a waterproof pouch containing 50 gold coins for the defenders' families. But Valet's genius extended beyond individual heroism. Every night, the Grand Master dispatched exactly enough reinforcements to keep St. Elmo fighting, but never enough to significantly strengthen it. The fort had become a deliberate sacrifice, a calculation as cold as winter steel. Each Ottoman soldier who died assaulting those crumbling walls was one fewer man available for the siege of Birgu. Each cannonball expended on limestone rubble was one less round available for the real battle to come. St. Elmo wasn't being defended, it was being weaponized. The psychological warfare escalated beyond conventional siege tactics. On June 15th, after losing 200 janissaries in a single morning assault, Ottoman commanders ordered something that violated every code of military honor. The heads of captured knights were loaded into cannons and fired into Birgu's central square. The message was unmistakable. This is the fate awaiting every defender. Surrender now or face systematic butchery. Valet's response arrived the following dawn. Turkish heads, catapulted from St. Elmo's walls, landed in Mustafa's camp with surgical accuracy. The 70-year-old Grand Master had just declared that 2 could play the game of terror. June 16th dawned with an ominous silence. No cannon fire, no trumpet calls. Ottoman assault troops massed in their trenches like coiled springs. 8,000 men preparing for what everyone knew would be St. Elmo's final hours. Captain Miranda walked the fort's shattered ramparts, counting his effective defenders. 9 knights remained capable of fighting. 9 men against the cream of the Ottoman Empire. The mathematics had reached their logical conclusion. The final assault began at noon, with a precision that would have impressed Caesar himself. Wave after wave of janissaries poured through the breaches, their scimitars flashing in the Mediterranean sun. The knights fought with the fury of men who knew death was inevitable, but refused to make it cheap. Miranda himself died sword in hand at his cannon, cut down while loading grape shot into the muzzle with his bare hands. Fra Juan de Guaras held the main breach alone for 10 minutes, his blade carving a circle of death around the knight's banner until Turkish arrows finally found their mark. When the white flag with its 8-pointed cross finally fell, Ottoman casualties for St. Elmo alone numbered 8,000 dead and wounded. Mustafa surveyed his Pyrrhic victory from the smoking ramparts, calculating costs that made his hands tremble. If a minor fortress defended by 120 men could exact such a price, what would the main defences of Malta demand? Behind him, across Grand Harbour, the real fortresses of Birgu and Senglea remained untouched, their walls bristling with artillery and their garrisons fresh for battle. The Ottomans had won St. Elmo, but they had lost something far more valuable. They had lost the summer. With St. Elmo finally silenced, Mustafa Pasha turned his artillery toward the real prize. The twin fortresses of Birgu and Senglea commanded Grand Harbour like stone guardians, their limestone bastions rising 80 feet above the water. Between them stretched a floating bridge protected by a massive iron chain, allowing defenders to reinforce each position rapidly. What the Ottomans faced was no longer a single fort, but an interconnected fortress complex designed by the finest military engineers in Europe. Valette had spent the month of St. Elmo's agony preparing his main defences for the storm he knew was coming. The bombardment that began on July 15th dwarfed anything Europe had witnessed. 100 Ottoman cannons firing simultaneously created sound waves that shattered windows in Sicily, 60 miles away. The mathematical brutality was staggering. Every minute, 200 stone balls weighing 50 pounds each crashed into the fortress walls, with impacts measuring 15 tons per square foot. The limestone dust rose in clouds so thick that noon became twilight, and men fought with scarves wrapped around their faces to breathe. But here's what separated Malta from every other siege in Ottoman history. The knights weren't just enduring the bombardment. They were fighting back with innovations that would revolutionize fortress warfare. Mobile cannon platforms allowed defenders to move their artillery between bastions as sections came under concentrated fire. Underground tunnels connected every major defensive position, enabling rapid redeployment of reserves. Most importantly, Valette had distributed command authority among his knights, ensuring that losing any single position wouldn't collapse the entire defense. August the 7th arrived with an ominous silence that made seasoned warriors check their weapons twice. At dawn, Ottoman signal flags fluttered from Mustafa's command post, coordinating the largest assault of the siege. 15,000 men would attack simultaneously from 3 directions. 5,000 Janissaries would storm Birgu's land walls, while another 5,000 struck Senglea from the south. Meanwhile, 5,000 Turkish Marines would assault the floating bridge from galleys, attempting to sever the connection between the fortresses. The mathematics were overwhelming. Even if the knights fought with superhuman skill, they faced odds of 25 to 1. The attack began at 6 a.m. with a precision that would have impressed Alexander the Great. Ottoman trumpets echoed across the harbour as assault columns advanced in perfect formation, their scimitars catching the morning sun like thousands of deadly mirrors. The sound was overwhelming. 20,000 feet marching in unison, the clash of steel on stone as ladders struck the walls, the roar of defenders shouting orders in 6 different languages. This wasn't just a battle. It was controlled chaos involving more men than most European cities contained. Then, everything accelerated beyond human comprehension. Janissaries reached Birgu's walls and began scaling ladders, while their comrades poured Greek fire into the breach created by weeks of bombardment. Turkish Marines swarmed aboard the bridge galleys, their boarding axes sparking against night steel in hand-to-hand combat that left no room for retreat. At the same moment, assault troops struck Senglea's southern bastion, their war cries echoing off limestone walls, as defenders poured boiling oil from the ramparts above. What happened next defied military logic. Jean de Valette, 70 years old and supposedly too frail for combat, appeared personally at Birgu's most threatened breach. The Grand Master fought with a 2-handed sword, his white hair streaming as he cut down Janissaries who had never imagined facing their enemy's supreme commander in single combat. His appearance electrified the defense. Knights who had been falling back suddenly surged forward. Maltese militia who had been wavering picked up, dropped weapons, and rejoined the fight. The tide turned in 17 minutes. Ottoman assault troops, expecting to face demoralized defenders, instead encountered resistance that grew stronger under pressure. The floating bridge held despite losing half its defenders. Senglea's walls remained intact despite concentrated bombardment. Most impossibly, Birgu's breach became a killing ground where Turkish elite died faster than reinforcements could replace them. By noon, 3,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the approaches to the fortresses, while night casualties numbered fewer than 200. But the real shock came when Mustafa tallied his losses that evening. The assault had cost him 15% of his entire army in 6 hours. At this exchange rate, taking Malta would require losses that would cripple Ottoman military power for a generation. Standing in his tent, surrounded by casualty reports, the general who had conquered half of Europe made a calculation that would echo through history. He could take Malta, but the price would destroy the very empire the victory was meant to serve. The question was no longer whether the fortresses would fall. The question was whether Suleiman's army would survive taking them. As the September 8th sun reached its zenith, the impossible had become reality. The relief fleet of Don Garcia de Toledo stretched across the northern horizon like a constellation of salvation. 28 galleys carrying 8,000 fresh Spanish and Italian troops toward Malta's smoking shores. From the ramparts of Birgu, Jean de Valette watched through his brass spyglass as the Ottoman army that had terrorized Europe for 4 months began its final, frantic preparations. Mustafa Pasha faced the nightmare scenario that had haunted his dreams since St. Elmo fell. His siege army, reduced to 25,000 exhausted men after months of grinding attrition, now found itself caught between the anvil of Malta's fortresses and the hammer of Spanish steel approaching from the sea. The timing was impossibly perfect, as if choreographed by divine providence. Don Garcia's landing boats hit the beaches at Meliéhir Bay precisely as Valette ordered his final gamble. The fortress gates of Birgu and Senglea swung open simultaneously, disgorging 600 knights and 3,000 Maltese militia who had survived the longest siege in Mediterranean history. These weren't fresh troops charging into battle. They were scarred veterans who had endured 15 weeks of daily bombardment, men whose eyes held the hollow look of those who had seen hell and survived to tell about it. What followed defied every principle of military science that Mustafa had learned in 3 decades of conquest. His army, positioned to assault the fortresses from landward approaches, suddenly faced attack from 2 directions simultaneously. The Spanish cavalry, 500 mounted knights led by Don Garcia himself, smashed into the Ottoman siege lines like a steel avalanche while the fortress defenders struck from behind. The psychological impact was devastating. Janissaries, who had spent months staring at Malta's walls, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy they had thought broken. The collapse was total and catastrophic. In 60 minutes of combat, the Ottoman siege army that had conquered Belgrade, Damascus, and Rhodes disintegrated into a fleeing mob. The mathematics of rout were merciless. 3,000 Turkish dead carpeted the ground between the landing beaches and the fortress walls, while Christian casualties numbered fewer than 200. Entire companies of Janissaries, the elite of Islamic military power, died where they stood rather than face the shame of retreat. Their white felt caps dotted the battlefield like fallen snow, each marking a warrior who had trained 15 years for this moment of disaster. Here's what the Ottoman chronicles tried to hide about those final hours. The retreat became a headlong flight that abandoned military equipment worth more than the annual revenue of most European kingdoms. 64 bronze cannons, each representing months of skilled craftsmanship, lay abandoned in their emplacements. Tens of thousands of stone cannonballs, cut and shaped by master masons, became rubble scattered across Malta's limestone plains. The siege that was supposed to demonstrate Ottoman supremacy had become the empire's most expensive military disaster. Mustafa Pasha, the general who had never lost a siege, stood on the deck of his flagship as Malta's cliffs receded into the Mediterranean haze. The butcher's bill made grim reading. Of the 40,000 men who had sailed from Constantinople in May, barely 15,000 remained effective for future campaigns. The Janissary Corps, backbone of Ottoman military power, had lost 8,000 men, including some of their most experienced officers. More devastating than the human cost was the strategic catastrophe. The Ottoman Empire had expended its entire annual military budget capturing a barren rock 17 miles long, then lost it again in a single afternoon. But the knights had paid their own terrible price for salvation. Of Valette's original 500 knights, only 250 remained alive and unwounded. the Maltese militia had suffered proportionally higher losses, with entire villages losing their adult male population during the siege. The limestone fortresses that had seemed so mighty in May now resembled lunar landscapes, their walls pocked with thousands of cannon impacts, their bastions rebuilt multiple times with rubble and desperate prayers. As evening fell on September 8th, the survivors gathered in the smoke-blackened chapel of St. Lawrence to offer prayers of thanksgiving. Valette knelt before the altar where he had prayed every morning of the siege, his white hair singed by Greek fire, his hands still bearing the calluses from personally manning the cannons during the August assaults. The Grand Master, who had defied mathematics and military logic for 107 days, finally allowed himself a moment of human exhaustion. Around him, his surviving knights removed their dented helmets and battle-stained surcoats, revealing faces aged years beyond the months they had endured. The victory bells that rang across Christian Europe that autumn carried news that would reshape the balance of Mediterranean power forever. Malta had held, but more importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered among the limestone rubble of St. Elmo's walls. The news of Malta's deliverance reached Constantinople on October the 3rd, carried by exhausted messengers who had ridden horses to death, bringing word of the disaster. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, now 72 and feeling every year of his age, received the reports in his private chambers overlooking the Bosphorus. The empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean had suffered its first major defeat in living memory. More devastating than the tactical loss was the strategic catastrophe it represented. The Ottoman war machine, seemingly unstoppable for 2 centuries, had revealed a fatal weakness. It could be bled white by determined defenders who understood the mathematics of attrition. The immediate consequences rippled across Europe like earthquake tremors. Venice, which had been preparing to surrender Cyprus rather than face Ottoman wrath, suddenly stiffened its resistance. The Pope, who had watched helplessly as Turkish fleets dominated the eastern Mediterranean, began organizing the Holy League that would culminate in the Battle of Lepanto 6 years later. Most importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered. Christian commanders, who had automatically assumed defeat when facing Turkish armies, began studying Malta's defensive innovations with the intensity of theologians parsing scripture. Here's what military academies still teach about Valette's genius. The Grand Master had solved the fundamental problem of fortress warfare through integrated defense systems that multiplied limited manpower exponentially. His innovations, connecting fortresses with underground tunnels and mobile artillery platforms, would be copied from Gibraltar to the Great Wall of China. The psychological warfare that began with swimming reinforcements to St. Elmo evolved into systematic deception operations that modern intelligence services recognize as foundational doctrine. Malta had become history's first laboratory for total war. But the human cost of salvation echoed through generations. Of the 500 knights who had stood on Bargu's walls that May morning, 250 lay buried in Malta's limestone soil. Entire bloodlines of European nobility ended in the smoking ruins of St. Elmo. The Maltese population, reduced by half during the siege, would take decades to recover. Villages that had stood since Roman times existed now only as charred foundations and painful memories. Victory had demanded a price that made survivors question whether any strategic objective justified such sacrifice. Suleiman never recovered from Malta's humiliation. The Sultan, who had terrorized Europe for 46 years, died 3 years later while besieging the Hungarian fortress of Szigetvar, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated strain of empire and defeat. His successors would launch increasingly desperate campaigns to restore Ottoman prestige, but the empire's golden age of conquest had ended in Malta's limestone dust. The tide of Islamic expansion that had swept across the Mediterranean for 3 centuries broke forever against Valette's walls. The irony that haunts military historians is how Malta's defenders achieved immortality through mathematics they never intended. Valette had calculated that sacrificing St. Elmo would bleed the Ottoman army beyond recovery. The Grand Master never imagined that his strategic patience would inspire Christian resistance from Lepanto to the gates of Vienna. The knights who swam across Grand Harbour, carrying ammunition to doom comrades, couldn't have known their individual courage would echo through centuries of military doctrine. They simply did their duty under impossible circumstances. Modern warfare still grapples with Malta's central lesson about the relationship between tactical brilliance and strategic patience. The fortress that seemed weakest, St. Elmo, became the weapon that destroyed an empire's military reputation. The old man who appeared too frail for combat, Jean de Valette, demonstrated leadership principles that military academies teach to this day. The tiny island that everyone assumed would fall in days proved that geography, properly defended, could channel historical currents, like a dam redirects rivers. May 18th, 1565. 500 knights of St. John faced 40,000 Ottoman warriors in a confrontation that should have ended European Christianity. When the guns fell silent 4 months later, those same 500 defenders had not merely survived. They had achieved something far more dangerous to their enemies. They had proven that overwhelming force could be defeated by superior will, innovative tactics, and the kind of disciplined courage that transforms ordinary men into legends. The mathematics of Malta revealed a truth that empires ignore at their peril. Sometimes the greatest victories belong not to those who count their soldiers, but to those who make every soldier count.